Hi, it's been a while since I've recorded a video. I have been going out and acquiring books. I've just been pretty busy, but I did a nice little acquisition of books at a auction, actually an online auction, but the pickup was just down in Bloomington, Indiana, not too far away, and there were a very interesting set of scholarly books about particularly rich in linguistics and also some medieval stuff and stuff that's both linguistics and medieval. I'm wearing the bow tie because it's Easter and I was cooking some mashed potatoes, and the bow tie is always more practical for cooking than wearing the four-hand necktie, which might get caught in something. So, first off, we have early English manuscripts in facsimile. This is not itself the facsimile. A facsimile is, a reproduction of a manuscript, which includes, it's meant to be an exact reproduction, oftentimes using photos and stuff, of the actual handwriting of the manuscript, any holes that might be in the manuscript, so on, that kind of thing. This is just the commentary that's meant to go along with the facsimile. So, we've got all kinds of neat Old English stuff going on here. This is the companion to a facsimile of the Vercelli manuscript, which is an Old English manuscript, which includes homilies in Old English, an Old English saint's life of Saint Guthlac, and also some Old English poems, I think including The Dream of the Rood. So that's definitely very interesting medieval study stuff. A little further afield geographically, this is an academic journal that actually still exists, which specializes, you could probably guess by the name, Tong Pao, in sinology and generally in sort of Asian matters, linguistic, historical, and so forth. I bought it because I recognized the name Paul Pelliot, who was one of the people involved in the discovery of the Dunhuang cave. He wasn't actually the guy who discovered it. A Chinese Taoist monk is actually the one who discovered the cave, which is one of these things that people dream about but doesn't often happen, where, you find a cave that's been blocked up since the 11th century and it's just piled high with medieval manuscripts about Buddhism and all sorts of stuff, not only Chinese, but other languages. So it was one of the most famous discoveries of the 20th century. And Pelliot, who is French, was one of the European scholars who was involved in deciphering it, bring it to public attention. And of course, since it's the early 20th century, there's a huge controversy about the circumstances in which the manuscripts, or many of the manuscripts, left China and came to France with him, and the price he paid for them, which was very low indeed, considering the priceless treasures that they were. But this is actually just an academic journal that he was editing, still very interesting. So the articles are Pelliot, something about linguistics, I'm sure. This article about the dog in ancient China, I think is the German, Der Hund im alten China, and then something about linguistics, like Altaic languages and Indo-European. Who knows, probably very controversial stuff. This is also funny because it's from the 40s. It's from 1944. So Pelliot, a Frenchman, and this guy who's also a famous sinologist, Duivendak, are editing an academic journal in which, I don't know if this guy was German, because sometimes, particularly back in the day, Scandinavian scholars would publish in German for an international audience, or French for that matter. But you have to imagine there was an awkwardness if he actually was a German, in 1944, because of the occupation of the other countries. Keeping on an Asian theme, this is really cool. This is about old Turkic inscriptions in Mongolia and Siberia. So this guy, Wilhelm Thomsen, was a Danish scholar, and most of us are probably used to thinking of, the steppe cultures as being non-literate. You know, the Chinese have this rich tradition of writing, but it's only more recently than that people out in the steppe have started writing. But although, of course, definitely the Chinese were more of a literary civilization than their neighbors, they're actually in Old Turkic. You know, people know Turkic from Turkish, but, you know, Turkish is part of a big language family, including, of course, the languages spoken in Azerbaijan and the languages that are currently spoken in Central Asia, like Uzbek, I believe, and Uyghur, which is also a Turkic language. And they're descended, you know, from Old Turkic. And there were, you know, nomadic Central Asian peoples living in what's now Mongolia and parts of Siberia who spoke Old Turkic, and not only spoke it, but they would actually engrave it in inscriptions, in giant stone stelae that you can still find, the most famous ones being the ones in the Orkhon Valley. But their alphabet, or actually, I don't know if it was alphabet, I think it was an alphabet, looked like this. It looks a little bit like Old Norse runes. There's no relationship. It's just that, you know, if your form of writing is carving things like into stone, you're going to choose straight lines and angles, because you think about how many, like, imagine like a lowercase g in the Latin alphabet. Think how many curves there are in that letter. You know, you don't want to carve that into a stone. So that accounts for the similarity. But fascinating stuff, you know, because you can find there are inscriptions from like the 8th or the 9th century in Old Turkic that talk about, you know, the political entities that existed out on the steppe at that time. All right, back to medieval Europe. Lupus of Ferreres, ascribed as an text critic, which this is a book, and I believe also this one is actually an example of a photographic facsimile. These are photographic reproductions of the original manuscript, as well as, of course, lots of, excuse me, if I go to the front of the book, commentary in English by Beeson, I believe. Is it Charles H. Beeson, the famous the famous American medievalist? But Lupus of Ferreres was probably not saying that place name correctly, he was a Carolingian monk and a famous scholar from the 9th century. So actually about the same time as some of those Turkic inscriptions, but about the opposite end of the Eurasian continent. So pretty interesting stuff there. And a good, solid, you know, if you're a Carolingianist or something like that, good solid addition to any library. Okay. Binney Dictionary. I didn't know much about this, and I still don't, but it's about a family of languages spoken in southern Nigeria. And, you know, dictionaries or other language reference works are always interesting and usually financially valuable when you're not talking about European languages or maybe other languages, like, say, Chinese or Arabic, that are very common world languages. Now, this language probably still has millions of speakers, but this is going to be much more, you know, in the English-speaking world, a much more reference work than, you know, say, like any random German dictionary or Spanish dictionary. Oh, political pamphlets are always another interesting thing to buy. Karl Marx in Error, his capital theory, clearly and undeniably refuted as unscientific, by Silvio Gesell. I just bought this because you find political pamphlets always very interesting. Often pamphlets don't survive the same way that books do, so sometimes they're rarer. I remember at a similar auction down in Bloomington, I actually bought a whole 5 different pamphlets at like $1 a piece that were publications of the North Vietnamese. Like, they had an official publishing house for English language international publications for, you know, propaganda purposes, or, you know, it's public information if you agree with them, and it's propaganda if you don't. But, you know, stuff like that was written by, like, General Giap, the famous North Vietnamese military commander. So that was interesting. But this, I didn't know anything about it, but I looked up Silvio Gesell, who was a German guy who had interest in economics. He was not a Marxist, but he was, I guess, what you might call a non-Marxist socialist. I don't really possess the wherewithal to explain his economic ideas, but he just read his Wikipedia article, and he was involved as like a minister of finance in the Bavarian Soviet Republic, part of the chaos of the German Revolution of 1918, 1919. Before, of course, he had to pull up stakes and go to Latin America. Probably the Freikorps would have shot him if they found. Actually, he was arrested and tried for treason, but he got off and was able to leave. But probably it was 50-50 whether the Freikorps was going to shoot him. But they decided not to for some reason. But it just interesting stuff. This reissue, I think, is much later. It's 1952, so it's probably, ironically, a non-Marxist socialist being reprinted by American anti-communists in the 50s or something. Okay, 2-volume work. Theodore of Mopsuestia on the Minor Epistles of St. Paul, and these are 2 volumes of Latin, which is probably not the original language, because this guy he was from Antioch, but is called of Mopsuestia because that's where he was bishop of later in life, and he was would have been a Greek speaker and writer in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I don't know much about him. Presumably, the sources maybe were preserved in Latin translation. There's also some Greek language text in here. I'll have to explore more, but basically this guy from the 4th century lived into the 5th century, which is a really interesting time in church history. He basically would have been around, born a couple of decades after Christianity was legalized by the Edict of Milan in 313, I want to say. And then this is the age of great controversies over Arianism. Nothing to do with Aryans and the Nazis. It's named after Arius, who was the guy who founded the heresy, shall we say. The Hesiarch. That's a nice sounding word, isn't it? Hesiarch. But interesting time in church history, because you've got the Arians, the Pelagians, all sorts of controversies about what the doctrine of the Christian church is going to be. So interesting from multiple angles. And let's see. Oh, we're back to linguistics. Here's an interesting one. The Wayot language, which is a grammar. I believe it might have some texts. Yes, it does have some texts where it actually is in the Wayot language, but it's mostly a descriptive grammar written in the 60s. And Wayot, which again I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, is an indigenous language of California, but Northern California specifically, like the Humboldt County area. And this is interesting because Wayot, along with a neighboring language, Yurok, is an Elgic language. So you know how language families work. You have big families of languages that are descended from a common ancestor. So like in Indo-European, everything from English to not all of the Indian languages, but some of them, like Hindi, some of the vernacular languages like Gujarat, or like the regional languages of India, like Gujarati and Bengali. These are also distantly related to English from an ancestor that existed like 5,000 years ago. And there are all other kinds of language families around the world. And Elgic is interesting because Elgic is these 2 Californian languages plus the Algonquin languages. And the Algonquin languages are, there's a whole bunch of them. Some on the Great Plains, like Blackfoot, Arapaho, Cheyenne, I think. A lot of them in the Great Lakes region of the United States, where I live, Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Kickapoo, and a whole bunch of other stuff, all the way up to the eastern coast of the United States, like the Wampanoag that the Pilgrims encountered in Massachusetts, speakers of an Algonquin language. Even down south, the Powhatan Confederacy down in Virginia that the Jamestown colonists encountered, speakers of an Algonquin language. But what's funny is, that big family, the Elgic family, is just these two languages way out in California, and then geographically the closest languages are out on the Great Plains, like the Blackfoot and Arapaho or something. So there's quite a geographical separation, and which happens with language families, but it's always interesting to think about how it happened. It has implications for, the prehistory of the Americas. But I just know about it because I'm not really an expert in Indian languages, but I do sometimes read about them because I have an interest, because of my interest in Ireland, I have an interest in the Irish language, and therefore an interest or a sympathy with marginalized languages that could do with revival. Oh, there's a nice map showing Wyatt and Uruk and their location, their geographical location. Speaking of Irish, one of the disappointments of the sale is that I wasn't able to get one of the things that was offered for auction, which was a 4-volume set of books from the Irish Text Society series, which is a series, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Loeb Classical Library, but there's the series where you have a bilingual edition with the original language and an English translation. So the Irish Text Society published editions of medieval and early modern Irish works. So the original would be in Old Irish or Middle Irish or maybe Classical Irish, and then it would also have an English translation to assist people learning the language with interpreting the original Irish language version. So very cool. And this, I just couldn't go as high as the other person was willing to go, considering that I wanted to buy all of this other stuff. And this would have been for my personal use. But, it went to like $50, and it would have been worth it because there were 4 volumes from the Irish Text Society series. And, like, if you wanted to buy those, you can buy them. They're still in print, but it's like 40 euros a piece, and you've got to pay the postage from Ireland. And so we all have our ups and downs and things that we didn't win. But one thing which I did win was this book, which is in French. And all I know is that Zeus, or whatever it is an ancient Egyptian series. And this is a nice academic book. We got your diagrams. We got your Egyptian hieroglyphics. We got your photographic plates of archaeological artifacts. Everything you need is in this book. And then what we have here is a book about pre-Columbian agriculture in Chile. I find pre-Columbian American history fascinating. I don't know much about it, but because I have an interest in the ancient world and the medieval world in Europe, I'm always interested what was going on at those times in other places. And it's always fascinating because with archaeology, historical linguistics, oral history, nowadays, genetics, as well as occasionally written sources from, for example, the Maya world, is you can actually know a little bit more about pre-Columbian history that sometimes people assume you can. This is an old book. It was written in the 30s, so with archaeology, that joke from The Simpsons where there's a flashback to a psychologist, and someone is causing havoc in the psychologist's office, and it's the 60s, and the psychologist says, leave those books alone, they haven't been discredited yet. Archaeology can sometimes be like that, just because there's new discoveries, you can always dig something new out of the ground. But works like these are still interesting because of their importance to the history of archaeology as a field. And this one's interesting. It's written in Spanish, but it's by this guy, Latham, who was an Englishman who moved to Chile and then became something of an anthropologist and archaeologist, which is interesting. All right. A very cool book we have here is a Hittite Christimothy. A Christimothy is a genre of language learning book where what it is it's a collection of texts in another language that are arranged for students to learn, or to help them practice and learn the language. So it's not like it's a complete grammar or whatever all by itself, but it has, tools to aid the student to read the text in the original language, and it's not just a random anthology of things written in another language. So, for example, this book, Hittite, very interesting story. Hittite is an Indo-European language of the Bronze Age, spoken in Anatolia and what's modern-day Turkey. And it's interesting because lots of different reasons. For one thing, it's the oldest Indo-European language to be written down. It was written down on clay tablets in cuneiform in the style that they copied, ultimately all the way back to the Sumerians. But the neat thing about that is, unlike writing on papyrus or vellum or, heavens forbid, paper, you can bury a clay tablet out in the ground, and as long as the person who's digging it up doesn't hit it with their shovel, you know that it's still going to be there, and possibly read, 4,000 years later or something, which is really great, because in the 19th century there was this huge explosion where suddenly all of this ancient history that was well before the Greeks and Romans suddenly became something that people could access again, because archaeologists discovered tablets, and then epigraphers and other people, linguists, were able to decipher them. And what's funny is Hittite is one of the later languages to be deciphered, like Egyptian, Sumerian, Akkadian. These are all ancient languages of the Near East, and in Egyptian's case, North Africa, that were deciphered in the 19th century. But Hittite wasn't deciphered until the 20th century, in part because I think the Hittite sort of kingdom's big archives in Hattusa weren't recovered by archaeologists until the 20th century. But what happened is it was like an explosion, like a bomb went off, because linguists had developed this portrait of the Indo-European family by comparing different languages, and particularly you're talking Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit in India were the oldest Indo-European languages. But Hittite was deciphered and found to be an Indo-European language, and it was like a bomb going off, because Hittite is like older by more than 1,000 years, basically, than say most of the stuff that's written in Greek, as well as, of course, being directly interesting to the history of this Bronze Age kingdom. And so this book, if you see the Christimothy, so see, we've got a list of Hittite signs in cuneiform. Incidentally, this is pretty different. I don't know the language, but it's pretty different from Sumerian cuneiform. But because of course they have to adapt it to write a completely different type of language, because Sumerian is a language isolate, and so Indo-European languages have different grammar and things like that. But anyway, so you see, you have the sign list. Now we have a text where the cuneiform that was originally on some clay tablet has been printed in this modern book. And then if we go a little further on, we get the same text, but this time we have a transcription in the Hittite language, but in the Latin alphabet. And then you have an English translation. And so the idea is that you'll have this book, and there's a bunch of different texts, and each is the same thing. First, the cuneiform, and then of course there's also commentary in addition to the translation. And the idea is that this is the other thing, along with the grammar, that you might use in a college class to learn Hittite. And I don't know if this is like the standard work or if they've got a new Timothy. And Hittite is one of those things where you talk to someone who knows a lot about Hittite, and they're like, well, actually, if you really want to know Hittite, you have to learn German, because all the best grammars are in German. Because Hittite, basically when it comes to dead languages, there's Latin. In terms of resources, there's Latin. There's tons of resources for Latin. And then it's ancient Greek, and then maybe biblical Hebrew, because of all the theological seminaries. But then any other dead language, you get into weirder things where it's like, oh, you might want to pick up this entirely unrelated modern language because all the best scholarship is in German or French or something. But, such is the lot of the scholar. So here's another thing, which is actually related to that Wyatt book we saw earlier, which is about Linguistics of Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. So we have a 2-volume work on Clackamas Chinhook. Chinhook is actually, I looked it up because of these books, is a small language family in the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon and Washington, Columbia River area. And so Clackamas is here, or Clackamus is the particular kind of branch of the Chinhook language family. It's a small language family. Sometimes there's this word primary language family, and that means a language family that's the overarching one that cannot be, at least so far, traced back any further. And some primary language families, like Indo-European, are very large and sprawling, but sometimes they're like Chinhook, where you have a small group of languages in like a geographical area that are related to each other, and then not much, they're not related to a whole bunch of languages. It's a small language family, but it is still a primary language family. But what this is cool is, this is an academic journal, but academic journals sometimes just devote whole issues to like the publication of like an actual book length monograph type work. So what this is as you can see, is it's Chinook texts. So this is not, primarily a grammar. What it is stuff. They went to people who spoke Clackamas Chinook and solicited, stories from them. And so as you can see, this one is arranged where you have English at the top and then the actual indigenous language at the bottom. And these kinds of texts are important because you have, a combined total of hundreds of pages of text, and hopefully there are recordings in some archive that go with it. There aren't always are. This one is from the 1940s. Sometimes you just have the written text, but of course with languages, it's always nice to have a recorded thing to go along with it. But anyway, these are important because I believe Clackamas Chinook is one of those languages, actually like Wyatt, which doesn't have anyone who currently alive who was raised speaking the language from like the cradle as a child. I phrase that very carefully because, of course, as with Irish, in fact, sometimes people, might still think of a language as being their native language if it's part of their heritage, even if they weren't raised from the cradle speaking it. And with languages like these, you can have people who have learned them later in life who still speak them fluently. I don't know what the situation is with Chinook or Clackamas Chinook, but I do believe it's a situation where there is no one who is currently alive who like learned the language from their parents when they were an infant. But these things are very important because this is hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's 600 pages, I think, across the two volumes. And of course, you might want to chop off half of that for being English translation or commentary, but it's still hundreds and hundreds of pages of actual text, in the original language. And you need, or at least I think you need these in addition to academic, descriptive grammars as sort of something that preserves the language so it can be revitalized later. And the relationship between linguists and the indigenous communities that they might collect languages from is not always uncontroversial, because sometimes you have a situation where, your grandparents spoke a language and then they were persecuted basically not passing that language on to their children, your parents. So you were only exposed to English, but then now to learn the knowledge of your heritage language, you have to go to some archive at some university where like your grandparents' recordings were. But definitely it's good that linguists did this work. And of course, continue to do it. There are languages that go extinct, not just in the world, but in fact in the United States, in the modern day. That's a sad note to end on. But, and some would say I'm part of the problem selling those texts for profit. But I do think that there is virtue as well as commerce in buying and selling used books in general. So that's about all. It'll probably take longer, but I also went to an estate sale of someone who was really into science fiction, and they had all these vintage like science fiction hardcovers. So that'll probably take a couple of weeks for me to sort through that. But until then, thanks kindly for the kind attention, and I hope you had a good Easter and or Passover if you observe those holidays, and just a good ordinary weekend if you don't.